So I'm gonna make a wild guess here and say that if you clicked on this video, you probably like Sonic the Hedgehog games. And one of the things about the Sonic games is that they are pretty unique. There's not a whole lot out there that plays like Sonic, which is kind of both a good thing and a bad thing. It's good because it means that the Sonic games really stand out, and there's not a whole lot that's like them, but at the same time, it also means that if you like the Sonic games, you don't really have a lot of options in terms of playing stuff with that kind of gameplay other than just playing more Sonic games. Your options are pretty limited. However, thankfully, in recent years, with the explosion of indie games, there actually are a number of games out there that have taken cues from Sonic the Hedgehog and offer similar gameplay in one way or another. And a lot of these games are really, really cool, but they don't really get as much attention as actual Sonic games do because they're not actual Sonic games. They don't have Sonic's name on them, which is unfortunate because so many of these games are extremely good and people are seriously missing out. Which is why I wanted to make this video, to highlight a bunch of these really cool Sonic-like games that do not get the attention that they absolutely deserve. So let's get into it. First game, of course, is going to be probably the most well-known Sonic-like game out there, Freedom Planet. You take one look at this game and you're like, yep, that's a Sonic game right there, for sure. And in fact, Freedom Planet originally was a Sonic fan game, but the creators decided to instead turn it into a brand new original IP, which I definitely think was to the game's benefit, as for one, it allowed them to make money off of this fantastic game, and secondly, it enabled them to do things outside of what you would typically see out of what you would want from a Sonic game. Because Freedom Planet isn't just like a Sonic game, but you don't play as Sonic. It also has some unique elements to it, primarily that there is quite a bit of focus on combat in Freedom Planet, actually. There's a lot of boss fights, and you actually have, like, attacks and moves, and you don't actually take contact damage in this game. You only take damage from enemies actually hitting you, and it works really well in this game. The combat is quite fun, certainly a lot better than what you get with the very, very simple and limited combat that you find in the Sonic games. And in fact, Freedom Planet doesn't just take its inspiration from Sonic, there's also a lot of treasure games, a lot of Gunstar Heroes. The developers of Freedom Planet themselves have even said that this is basically like a Sonic game if it was made by Treasure, which you can definitely feel in many ways. Another thing I like about Freedom Planet is that it makes many adjustments and tweaks to the core Sonic formula that I think are absolutely to the game's benefit. A lot of just small little improvements and modifications here to kind of smooth out the game and kind of fix issues and improve the pacing. There's just lots of nice little things here that I would like to see potentially the Sonic games adopt one day. Another thing I like about Freedom Planet is that you have 3 playable characters that kind of fill the role of like your Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles equivalents, but these characters have a lot more different to them than any Sonic characters do in any Sonic game. You have very, very different movesets and abilities depending on the character you play as, which I think is great. It means that the gameplay is much more varied. Doing multiple playthroughs with this game as each of the different characters, you really do feel the differences a lot. Certainly a lot more so than you do when you play the Sonic games and you play through the game as like Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles, where it's mostly the same, but you have like one unique ability that makes everyone stand out. Freedom Planet does a lot more than that. In fact, there's even some levels exclusive to certain characters built specifically to focus on their unique movesets, which is really cool. So yeah, that's pretty much Freedom Planet. Fantastic game. I actually cannot overstate how good Freedom Planet is. It is absolutely incredible. If you've not played Freedom Planet before, you seriously need to go fix that. It is an incredibly good game. And then, of course, we also have to talk about the sequel, Freedom Planet 2, which is basically everything that's great about the first Freedom Planet, but even better. More mechanics, more moves for all the characters, an additional playable character. They added a parry to the game to flesh out the combat. There's even combat arenas you can do where you fight a bunch of enemies and stuff. It's just super good. It's everything great about Freedom Planet, even better. Or at least that's the impression I've gotten of the game so far. I haven't actually played Freedom Planet 2 for myself yet. I only played the demo, which is what you're watching here, but just off of this one level demo, I'm already like, holy shit, this game is fucking incredible. And I've heard nothing but great things about it, so I think it's a pretty safe bet that Freedom Planet 2 is probably sick. And going along with Freedom Planet, the other most well-known Sonic-like game out there would be Spark the Electric Jester. For anyone that doesn't know, the creator of the Spark games used to make Sonic fan games that were extremely good. And Spark, in many ways, is very similar to Freedom Planet, where you look at it and you're clearly like, yeah, that's a Sonic game there for sure. But it also expands upon traditional classic Sonic gameplay in many ways, including adding combat to it. But where Freedom Planet is kind of Sonic mixed with Gunstar Heroes as if it was developed by Treasure, Spark the Electric Jester is more like Sonic mixed with Kirby as if it was developed by Platinum Games. One of the big elements of Spark is that you can get all of these different powers that grant you different movesets with different abilities, very similar to the Kirby games, and you can stock up to 2 of these abilities and swap between them on the fly, and these really change up how you play. Essentially, every single power is its own playable character, and you have the freedom to just use whatever you want. And it's just really cool and fun to be able to experiment with all these different movesets and pick your favorites and rock through the game with the ones you like. And you get a lot of variety as well, as you can just constantly be swapping through your powers, trying a bunch of different stuff. You get a lot of variety that way in terms of how you play. Not only do all the different abilities grant you different ways to platform, but they also give you vastly different combat moves and different movesets and stuff. Spark, in a similar vein to Freedom Planet, has many bosses that you'll be fighting throughout the game, though the combat ends up playing quite a bit differently than Freedom Planet does, as, like I said, Spark kind of takes its inspiration from things like Bayonetta. You got an invincible dodge move, you got parries, and with all the different abilities that you have through the game, you can fight enemies in lots of different ways, and if you really know how to play well, you can annihilate bosses very quickly without ever taking a hit. But Spark is not at all an easy game, especially towards the later part of the game. It starts to get really freaking hard and really cool. And you also get higher difficulties that you unlock as you beat the game, and those are really fun. Spark the Electric Jester is just a fantastic game. And like Freedom Planet, it too has a sequel, Spark the Electric Jester 2, where we now bring the series into 3D. It basically is just the exact same kind of gameplay that you got from Spark the Electric Jester, but now in 3D. And that is a very nice thing, as there's not a whole lot of 3D Sonic-like games out there, and Spark 2 is a game that gives you an opportunity to feel what it would be like if we got a 3D Sonic game that had proper Sonic momentum physics. Many Sonic fans, including myself, disparage the fact that the physics of the 3D Sonic games have never really quite been there and never properly transitioned the classic Sonic gameplay into 3D, but stuff like Spark 2 actually does manage to get something pretty close to that, and it shows that this type of gameplay can absolutely work in 3D and be super duper fun. The only unfortunate thing about Spark 2 is that while Spark 1 had really good and really fun combat, the combat in Spark 2 is complete and total trash, unfortunately. It's basically been reduced to just button mashing and then just parrying anytime an enemy is about to attack, and so there's pretty much nothing here anymore when the combat in Spark 1 was actually pretty cool and fun. So that's unfortunate. But that may not exactly be much of an issue, because there is also Spark the Electric Jester 3, which kind of, in a way, almost might invalidate Spark the Electric Jester 2, as there was recently an update for Spark 3 that added all of the levels from Spark 2 into the game. And Spark 3 plays basically exactly the same as Spark 2, but just even better, and improved even further upon what it was. It's got extra mechanics and extra refinements to the gameplay. It's pretty much just the same thing, but better. And another thing that Spark 3 does is it kind of salvages the combat and improves it quite a bit, so you might not even necessarily need to get Spark 2, though, you know, the games might have their differences that in some ways Spark 2 could be better, but honestly, I think you should just buy it anyway just to support the creator because he makes awesome games. Once again, I've not actually played Spark 3 for myself yet, but the guy who makes the Spark games has never let me down. Literally every single one of the games that he's made has been excellent, so I feel pretty comfortable in saying that this one probably will be too. And again, just like Freedom Planet 2, the reception of this game has been extremely positive. So yeah, that's Freedom Planet and Spark, the two biggest and most notable of the Sonic-like indie games out there, and they are absolutely incredible. You should absolutely go play all of these games. If you like Sonic games, then I can pretty much guarantee you're going to love them. However, those are just the most well-known Sonic-like indie games out there, but there are actually many more than that that don't get nearly as much attention, so let's talk about some of those, starting with the game Defunct. This is a very cool little indie game that very much follows the kind of design philosophy of the original 2D Sonic games. It's all about manipulating the terrain to increase your speed based on the physics of the gameplay. And those physics are extremely similar to the ones you find in Sonic. And actually, Defunct has a much better thematic justification for these game mechanics than the Sonic games do. Because in Defunct, you play as a little robot on a wheel that has a broken engine, and so you can only accelerate up to a very, very slow speed. But you can take advantage of gravity and downhill slopes to accelerate past your default speed limit. And along with that, Defunct has a mechanic akin to rolling in Sonic, where you kind of gravitize yourself, and that increases the effect of gravity on you, meaning that when you're going downhill, you'll gain even more speed, and when you're on flat ground or going uphill, you'll lose more speed, just like rolling in the Sonic games. And Defunct is all about riding the wave of the terrain in order to go as fast as you possibly can to get to the end of the level. And, I mean, just look at this gameplay. Look at how freaking fun this looks. There's a couple of other mechanics, like you can magnetize yourself to metal surfaces to stick to them, and you can also get a boost that you can fill up to use that to speed yourself up a little bit. But for the most part, you're relying on the physics to do everything in this game, and it is super duper fun. One thing I really like about Defunct is that when you're flying through the air, there's a little line that you can see of your travel path so you know where you're going to land, and you can actually gravitize in this game while in the air to make yourself start falling more sharply to kind of land precisely where you want to, which is a really nice feature for a fast-paced momentum platformer like this. Defunct isn't a game that has that much emphasis on more traditional platforming, though. It's pretty much all about using the terrain to speed forward as quickly as possible. But I'm not really going to complain about that because it's super duper fun. It is a short little game, but absolutely a very, very good game, and I highly recommend it. Next up on the list is a game called Polyroll, which is kind of in the vein a little bit of the 8-bit Sonic games, I would say. Its emphasis on, like, Sonic physics is a lot less so than a lot of the other games that I'm going to be covering in this video. And a lot like a lot of the other games here, this game isn't really trying to emulate Sonic in terms of, like, level design and gameplay style very much. It's kind of more of just a traditional 2D platformer with somewhat Sonic-esque physics to it. But that ends up working out pretty well for it. It's quite a fun game. Not the most amazing or spectacular thing in the world, but a solid little 2D platformer with some Sonic-esque mechanics that are quite nice. If you're looking for just a solid little 2D platformer, Polyroll will get you done. And another game made by the same developer is Panic Porcupine, which is kind of like Sonic crossed with Super Meat Boy. You have very small, challenging levels, and you die in one hit, and there is death all around you. And Panic Porcupine is a game that is very happy to poke fun at itself for being such an obvious Sonic-inspired game. Lots of jokes and stuff where it parodies Sonic, which I can appreciate. One thing that's worth noting about Panic Porcupine is that this game does not have any spin dash equivalent in it. You have to rely completely on the momentum physics to do everything. So Sonic 1 stands should certainly like it, I think. Next game I want to cover is Action Henk, which is a 2D platformer that, lo and behold, has very Sonic-esque physics and mechanics. You have a slide in this game that you can use to go downhill and build up speed, and then you can use that speed to go faster and make big jumps off of slopes and such. Blah, 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 you get the picture at this point. It's a Sonic game, basically. This game is very, very time trial focused. You have very short levels that are just about doing this one sequence as well as you possibly can to get the best time possible, and it works pretty well. It's a very fun game. I like the aesthetic of the game, of it all being toys and stuff, and if you look in the backgrounds, you can see many nods to Sonic games there. This game is definitely not hiding its inspirations or anything. One game that's a little bit more distanced from Sonic, but definitely still has some similarities, would be Super Fancy Pants Adventure, which is the latest game in a series of old Newground Flash games that are pretty cool. Those games are also similar, but I'm just highlighting this one here as it's kind of the latest and greatest of the series. And this game is more of an action-adventure platformer than it is like an arcadey action platformer like the Sonic games, But it definitely has those kinds of slope momentum physics going on for sure, and the game is very fun, and you know, it's kind of got some similar feels to it. Again, you can slide while going downhill to build up speed, and yada yada. It's a very good game, and this game also has a little bit of an emphasis on combat to it, and it's pretty good. Just a solid little game right there, highly recommended. As you can tell by this point, a lot of these games, when they're inspired by Sonic, the biggest thing that they take from Sonic is the momentum physics stuff of it. Obviously, that's like the biggest and most defining feature of the Sonic games. However, not everything that takes inspiration from Sonic is taking the physics from it. There are other mechanics in the Sonic series that are pretty iconic to it in a certain way, such as the homing attack, of course. This became a staple in pretty much every single Sonic game. And there are actually a couple of games out there that have taken the idea of the homing attack and kind of tried to expand upon that in interesting, cool ways. The first one of these games I want to highlight is Super Dream Dasher, which takes the idea of the homing attack and makes it a little bit more manual than it is automatic. Instead of automatically locking onto enemies, now you have an omnidirectional air dash that you can point in whatever direction you want, and by pointing it toward an enemy, that will cause it to lock on and then launch you toward the enemy. So instead of just pressing the button repeatedly and the game does everything for you, this is all completely manual. You have to aim yourself into the enemies in order to homing attack them, and just that adds quite a bit of extra fun and challenge to doing it. What in a Sonic game would just be repeatedly pressing the jump button, in this game actually requires speed and precision, which is really cool. And the game has a really nice flow to it, where you're trying to chain everything together in one big sequence. The game even has these trails of these, I guess, turnip things that they are, where if you dash into that, then you'll go along the trail just like a light speed dash. So yeah, solid little homing attack focused platformer there, definitely a lot of fun. But another indie game that takes the idea of the homing attack and expands upon it in cool ways is a very obscure game called Skybolt Zack. This expands upon the idea of the homing attack in a completely different way. It takes the idea of just pressing a button and automatically launching yourself toward the enemy and kind of tries to lean into that, and kind of turns the game into a bit of almost like a rhythm game feeling thing, where you have enemies of various different colors, and if you press the corresponding button, then you'll lock onto that enemy and homing attack onto them. And so it's a game that requires a lot of precision in terms of making sure you press the right button at the right time to fly forward at high speed, bouncing off of every single thing you can. If you press the wrong button, then you're going to end up taking damage instead of killing the enemy, so you gotta make sure that you're doing the right thing at all times. And it just results in a really fast and fun game, where you have to identify what's ahead and what to do, what buttons to press, and you gotta do it all really, really fast. There's a lot of gameplay in Sonic games that essentially does kind of boil down to just pressing the button you're supposed to press at the right time, and in that way, Skybolt Zack definitely feels in line with those kinds of Sonic games. And it's also got some extra stuff going on in terms of mechanics that are cool, like you can air dash and you can manipulate which direction you're going to launch off of an object when you homing attack it. You can charge one of your buttons to increase the radius at which your homing attack will lock onto things to let you hit stuff you wouldn't otherwise be able to hit. There's some cool stuff going on here, and actually Skybolt Zack even has some traditional Sonic-esque level design going on to it as well, where the levels are multi-tiered and you have different routes at different elevations, and the more difficult paths are at the top. And if you mess up, then you're gonna fall down to the lower route below. But it also kind of takes that and expands upon that idea by having it be that there are multiple level exits depending on what tier of the level you finish it on. And depending on what exit you take, that's going to send you to a different level. And the levels at the top are more difficult than the ones at the beginning, which is pretty cool. Gives the game a lot of replay value and gives you a lot of incentive to try and master the game and get through all of the most difficult levels. And of course, just look at the game. Like, it's super fast-paced and action-packed and really, really cool. You just look at this game and you're like, damn son, that looks fun. I want to play that, right? Oh, and by the way, the music in this game is fucking incredible. Next game I want to cover is one that's fairly light in terms of being inspired by Sonic, but there's a little bit going on there, and it's just a really solid game, so I want to recommend it anyway, which is Lunistice. This is kind of more of just a general 3D platformer. It's not too Sonic-like particularly, but you can definitely see that there is a decent amount of Sonic inspiration in this game. The biggest one being that by default the game is not like a binary precision platformer. You do actually have that kind of Sonic thing where you accelerate up to your top speed, and you even have a little bit of a turning radius, giving you a bit of feeling of momentum, which is pretty nice. And there are a couple of aspects of the game which do feel a bit Sonic-like, but for the most part, it's just a really solid, simple 3D platformer. It's very straightforward. It's just you got a double jump and a spin attack move that can also function as a triple jump. And you just play through linear levels and have a good time. It's a very solid game. Definitely recommended. And that's it for Sonic-like games that are currently available, but there are a number of them that are currently in development that I think are really cool and very promising looking that I also want to highlight here. First up is Kyle and Lucy Wonderworld, which, I mean, you know, you just look at it and you're like, okay, yep, this is a Sonic game. And pretty much everything is accounted for. You got rolling in the form of your characters equipping some roller skates to slide downhill. You got a spin dash equivalent, and by default the characters are equipped with the ability to cling to walls and climb them, Knuckles style, but you can also do the spin dash move up walls, which I definitely approve of. That is super duper fun. Very promising looking game. I'm definitely looking forward to it, though currently I believe the development of the game is on hiatus as the developers are working on a smaller game that takes place in the same universe called Sondro Gomez, and this is kind of a Castlevania inspired game, which is also really fun by the way, and you should go check this game out too. And actually, Sondro Gomez is being worked on by Headcanon, which, for those who are unaware, are some of the people that worked on Sonic Mania. Also, by the way, look at these fucking scratch and grounder motherfuckers over here. This might not be a Sonic-like game, but you can definitely see that it's still taking a decent amount of inspiration from Sonic in some ways. But I'm getting off topic, back to Sonic-like games, but actually kind of keeping with the Castlevania theming, next up is Brock Crocodile, which isn't really very Castlevania-like at all. It's just that you have a whip as your main attack, but other than that, it's pretty much just a more straightforward kind of 2D action-adventure platformer with some Sonic inspiration. It's got some really nice 8-bit inspired pixel art, and it's really, really fun. Solid level design from what I've played so far in the demo, and this game is kind of taken more a vein of like a Shovel Knight style approach in terms of it's a little bit more story focused. You have like a town that you can visit and talk to NPCs and stuff like that. I believe the game is still fairly early, but again, quite a promising looking little game right here. I'm definitely going to be checking this out when it gets released. Here's one that I just recently discovered that looks super duper cool, Soda-Powered Penguin. As you can see, it's got the physics going on, but the way this game works is you have a dash move that you can do in any of the cardinal directions. And what's cool is that as long as you don't do an upward dash, you can actually do any number of dashes while in the air, which offers for a lot of cool movement opportunities and a lot of really fun gameplay. You can also dash into certain surfaces and stick your beak into them to then, like, fling yourself around. Very similar to that one bird thing that you could control in Super Mario Odyssey, which is really, really fun and combos with the kind of momentum physics gameplay of this game really, really nicely for lots of cool platforming challenges. In terms of level design, this game feels very, very inspired by Celeste to me, with how it goes for kind of like a focused one-screen kind of design, but with momentum physics instead of being like a tight precision platformer, which is definitely to my preference, and I thought this game was super duper fun, and really, really promising looking. Though, interestingly, while the level design feels very Celeste, the actual game structure, at least for this one level here that I played, is actually kind of inspired by the Wario Land games a bit, where you go through the level initially one way, and then once you get to the end, then you have a timer that activates, and you have to get all the way back to the beginning of the level, which is pretty neat. Super duper fun game. Really, really looking forward to this one. I really liked what I played in the demo a lot. And finally, I would like to highlight Project Rascal, which is a game being developed by, once again, people who have made extremely good Sonic fan games in the past, and that definitely comes through with this game here. This is another one kind of in the vein of Spark the Electric Jesters 2 and 3, where it's kind of a traditional classic momentum-based Sonic gameplay, but in 3D. but Rascal is kind of being a little bit more traditional and faithful to the core Sonic formula. You got a double jump, an air dash, a bounce, a stomp, and a drop dash as well. Oh, and also homing, attacking, wall jumping, and grinding on rails. I know it kind of looks a bit rough, but the game is still super early, and let me tell you, already it is extremely fun. I particularly like how you can cancel a stomp into a drop dash. That is very, very cool. This is definitely a game by people that know how to make a really cool Sonic-esque game. I mean, the fan game that they did previously, Sonic GT, is absolutely fantastic. So I have no doubt that Project Rascal is also going to be extremely good. And there you have it, a bunch of really, really cool Sonic-inspired games out there that I definitely think are worth giving a look. As someone that loves Sonic games, I'm very happy to see a lot of games now inspired by Sonic starting to crop up, and taking the Sonic formula and doing new and interesting and cool different things with it. If any of these games look cool to you, then I highly recommend checking them out. They're all really, really fun. And I learned about most of these games through Sage, the Sonic Amateur Games Expo, which is an online showcase of Sonic fan games, as well as just indie games, whether they be inspired by Sonic or not. And there's lots and lots of cool stuff to check out here and on the Sonic Fan Game HQ, so I definitely recommend checking those out. I'll have links in the description of those so you can browse around and see what's out there. I didn't cover absolutely every single Sonic-like game in existence in this video, just a lot of ones that I found that I think are really cool. Who knows, potentially in the future I could do more videos like this as more games like these are being made. I could definitely get down with that kind of idea because a lot of these games are super cool and not enough people know about them. And for fans of mine, I'm probably eventually going to be doing dedicated video reviews for pretty much every game that I covered in this video, as well as many other Sonic-like games and just cool games out there with platforming momentum physics. I just love shit like this. And actually, along those lines, there is one final secret bonus game that I want to highlight in this video. A very, very obscure game called Cloudbuilt. This isn't really too much of a Sonic-like game. It does have a little bit of similarities and some nods to Sonic here and there, but for the most part, Cloudbuilt is just an extremely fun and super cool 3D momentum platformer that I highly recommend. It's actually one of my favorite games of all time, which is why I'm highlighting it here, because I think anyone that's a fan of Sonic games is definitely going to dig Cloudbuilt. But instead of just talking about how great it is, how about I just show you? So I'm just going to leave you with some raw gameplay of Cloudbuilt. If this game looks cool, you should absolutely check it out. Thanks for watching, hope you enjoyed. I'll see you later.